Welcome to Tech Tuesday number 52. And today we're going to talk about IP not being just an appendix, but actually being the main dish in a positive sense. But before we start, we're going to take a moment of silence. We still have 79 hostages that are out there. Mm. I'm going to start with a summary of what today is about. IP activities should be ruled by hope, not by fear. That means that IP is part of your success and not only part of your risk management. And I'll give you a metaphor. When you drive a car to a restaurant, which is really what having a startup is like. So do you spend all of your energy worrying about your engine, mechanics, and the other drivers and so on? Or do you look forward to having a great time with your friends? So if you look at the metaphor, IP is the engine management systems that makes everything work properly. It's also a little bit stuff like seat belts and airbags and ADAS, um, automatic driver safety features. Now, there's a truism that patent attorneys, most of that most patent attorneys believe in, and that truism is that people don't think enough about IP, they don't treat it with respect, they ignore it, and so on. And I think it's a truism because apparently somebody contacted me on the internet and pointed out that where she is in the field of grants and deep tech, they always care about IP. But the point is that even innovation companies, and they live on innovation, they don't treat IP properly. They say, oh, we'll talk about patents later. We don't need to think about IP now. We have bigger problems and so on. And I think it's the most troubling at the early stage of the company when thinking about IP can be the difference between succeeding and failing, and especially avoiding expensive mistakes. And if we want an example, OpenAI. I don't like the IP strategy, at least the visible part of it. And it seems to me like they ignored IP at the earlier stages, and maybe even now. Or if you look at Zoom, they took the world by a storm and had no moat, definitely no IP moat. And now Microsoft Teams that we're using now has crushed them. Where's it different? Where one of the executives was harmed by IP, they lost a big patent case, they care about IP. And the bottom line is that, again, I'm calling it a fact, that very often IP is considered to be, only a cost or something that you do afterwards to finish it up. It's not part of what you should be doing. It's, just an add-on. And we all believe that these people are wrong, but, maybe we're the ones driving the wrong way on the highway. And we believe too much in what we're selling, IP. And maybe they're right. For example, if IP were really important, then a typical MBA would have at least one whole course, not just a lecture, on IP. And it's very strange, they don't have most of them, even though we all like touting the statements that in most companies, 80%, 90% of the value is intangible assets. Do investors care about IP? Well, at the early stages, not so much. Sometimes they expect you to have IP so they can, check the box, yeah, they have IP. Here's a study which does talk about patents being meaningful for venture capital financing, but many companies do due diligence and nobody asks any questions about the IP. In addition, you want to move fast and break things, and we know that IP isn't exactly like that. So if IP is more like a seatbelt, so if you're in a rush, so you don't put on your seatbelt, you have a small risk, but you have other risks that you have to deal with. And last but not least, patents are about technology. So the R&D department should be thinking about it, not the founders. And then you have the typical policies that first you invent something and then you file a patent. Now, I don't agree with it, but it actually seems to make sense. If IP is about protection of a product or market, then if you don't have anything to protect yet or your product is not complete, why are you dealing with IP? And when you talk about risk management, a startup company has much bigger risks than IP risks. And even if you want to talk about IP for risk management as being important, everybody knows, even though it's not true even in military sense, that active offense is better than defense. And in IP, offensive actions means lawsuits. And no startup company can deal with lawsuits at this stage. So if you think about it, it definitely appears to make sense that executive attention should not be wasted on IP. Now, it seems to make sense, but nothing of what I said now is actually correct. And I'm also not going to talk about it today. Maybe a teeny little bit, because that's not my goal. What I want to do is, instead of arguing with all of these people out there that feel something which may be rational, is give positive reasons why IP should be considered early. And I'm going to start with a myth. People believe that IP in an early stage company is about filing patents. Why do they believe it? Because that's where the money is. And when we talk to clients, they say, oh, I'm not yet ready to file patents. We'll call you up when we're ready to file patents. And people also believe that patents are about blocking. And for that, you need maturity, both of the market and of what you want to block. So this is incorrect. And one of my main arguments today is that doing IP is, first of all, what I call IPing, the action of IP. I'm going to talk about it later. Sometimes you also file patents, but trade secrets, designs, know-how, ownership issues, freedom to operate, not just patents. And I'm ignoring other IP like trademarks and brands because I have to focus the discussion somehow. And regarding blocking, patents have usually, often, you should look for it, much more value in controlling and promoting collaboration than in just blocking. There are exceptions, but when you can, collaboration using IP is a way to go, especially using patents. Now, I'll go even further. Even if IP is meant for risk avoidance, that is not an excuse to use IP only for risk avoidance. And the classic risk is I don't want people to copy me. So if we consider IP to be like a seatbelt, when you bungee jump, the seatbelt, the rope holding you, does more than just save you in case of an accident. And one of the problems is that when people think about IP, they're busy thinking about being defensive. And I want to give you a few examples where a feature which is provided in order to avoid risk is actually used today in order to provide additional functionality. So you have parachutes, which keep you from squashing on the floor when you jump out of a plane. But if you modify them a bit, you get paragliders where you can fly. Bicycle helmets, very important. I know, I've used one once, saved my life. But you can use them to get these teardrop shaped helmets, which reduce your air drag and allow bicycle riders to ride even faster. Seat belts are fun, but if you take one of those upside down roller coasters, you have to have them. And the point that I'm trying to make in today's talk is that IP should be used in order to increase your value, let's call it directly, and not only in order to avoid risk. So I made this cute 2x2. What is your IP investment for? It can be for now, or it can be for later, and it can be for avoiding risk, or it can be for generating opportunity. And if you notice in the bottom left corner, I wrote in big letters, this is the subject of the talk, IP investment now in order to generate opportunity and value now. So when the decision maker has to answer the question, should I do IP work? The answer should be yes. And the reason is not only because it's good for later, but because right now it gives me value. And of course, this is a 2x2, it could be a 4x4, and so on, but less important. So what is opportunity that I had in this 2x2 when we talk about IP? Obviously, IP can be used to increase the valuation of your company, which is basically what other people are willing to pay for it. But it can also increase the intrinsic value of your company when you don't have any particular buyer. And it can make your company more value by adding capabilities, flexibilities, and so on. And of course, it can also create options for later. So all of these four quadrants should get attention. But let's talk about now. And now the problem you have is not that somebody's going to copy you. And the problem you have is not that sometime in the future you won't make enough profit. And the point I want to make is that at every stage of the company's journey, IP can be used to help it now achieve general goals and specific goals, not just later. But before I get into that, IP has a cost as well. It's not for free. And I'm not talking about the cost of filing a patent. And it's an opportunity cost, meaning if you spend your management attention on IP, you're not going to spend it on regulatory deals. So I mentioned before, doing IP is a verb, and I call it IPing. And it's a function that the company has where they think about IP, and I'll explain in a minute what it means to think about IP. And sometimes the result of this thinking is also an action which can actually cost money, like filing a patent application, or require management attention, like keeping secrets. Now, IP is the lifeblood of innovative companies. It's not just an option, it's what the company works on. And I'll give you a metaphor. So if you have a race car, the race car has an engine. And the engine is serviced using a spanner, for example. If you are developing a product, the product has IP in it, and the IP is leveraged using IP rights, okay? IP and IP rights are not exactly the same thing. And there's often too much focus thinking about IP rights, should I file a patent, rather than what did I invent, which is the IP. And lest you think that everybody should do IP all the time and so on. No. Each company has different importance of IP and different importance and type at different stages. It depends, for example, on what kind of moat the company has. But even if we talk about a company, which we spoke to a few days ago, they are what I would call a mini monopoly. They have a part of the market and nobody can get even close to them. So they treat IP as an afterthought. We check how much money we have. If there's anything left over, we can spend it on IP. Why? We don't need the IP. We're a monopoly. But if you want to keep the monopoly, yeah, you're going to need IP. Or you have a company which is very successful because of operations, and you might ask yourself, so it doesn't need IP? Well, a company that has very good operations has a lot of IP, but perhaps you shouldn't be protecting it using a patent, which is a type of IPR, but at the very least, are you managing the knowledge that you're using in order to get successful operation? So what is IPing? First of all, the goal is for you, and by you, I don't mean patent attorney, IP manager. I mean the decision makers in the company, is to understand how IP relates to the company, meaning where does it come from and where does it go, what damages it, what does it interact with, and understanding how IP could be used as a strategic tool, either for generating opportunities or for dealing with risks. So it's a process, and this is what you want to get out of the process. And as I pointed out, when you do think about IPs, the result might be that, yeah, you're going to file a patent or five, or identify a few secrets you need to keep more carefully, and so on. In order to do IPing, you first of all need some sort of space in the mind of the decision makers. You also need regular activities that relate to it. It's very easy to otherwise ignore it. You also need one-time activities, for example, a response to some event, and you need some sort of mechanism for feeding the output of this IP process into other departments. And the output can be IP output or non-IP output. Now, I say sadly that IPing usually starts with an audit. It usually, unfortunately, doesn't start on day one, but on day 17, there's already a company, and you have to start off with running an audit and figuring out what do you have and what was done. And of course, you need an IP professional like myself, or there are many others like me. And the reason is because they have knowledge, they have skill, and they have experience. All of these things are needed when somebody who doesn't know much about IP, like most management people, is trying to do the IP process. But they cannot do it alone. They have to do it together with the management people, and they cannot do it only once because it keeps on changing. A big advantage of IPing is a classical problem of, are you working in the company or are you working on the company? A startup usually develops two products. One is the product you sell to people, and the other one is the company itself, which you sell to investors. Not always, but often at the early stages of the company, you focus on building a proof of concept of the product or other activities that reduce the risks. Now, hopefully you consider, IP risks, but what usually happens is that the principals of the company don't put too much effort on building a valuable company, except in the dealing with issues like how do we scale and how do we hire people. And IP is a way by which you can not only make the company look more mature, but actually be more mature. And why is that? First of all, IP is part of what makes a company viable. And second, the working on IP helps, I call it regularizing, okay, but it's building connections and channels inside the company. It helps focus the company. It helps highlighting the competition and the future. And it forces the people in the company to work on improving the company itself. So if you think about a typical startup where there's an imbalance between working on the company and working in the company, doing IP properly is part of the way of correcting that balance, which immediately makes the company more valuable and more likely to succeed. So why does this happen? I'm sure you're familiar with the story of, for the want of the nail, a horseshoe was lost, and then a horse was lost, and it was a general's horse, and they was in the middle of a charge, and they lost the battle. But many startups focus on the nail, meaning they've identified a critical problem which needs to be solved, and once you solve it, you can build a product around it. So at the beginning, the startup is trying to build the nail, but as it develops, it's going to provide an entire product. This means that the startup really is in a box of intense focus on this critical problem or critical path or vision. And one of the things that IP does is it helps you break out of the box. It gives you thinking diversity. It forces you to think about strategy, a goal orientation, and really the other in general. When you're trying to solve a problem, you usually ignore your competition. You ignore your customers. You ignore your investors. The problem is very big. And IP, by its nature, is about the other and what the others want and how they're going to want to do it with different technology and different goals and different business solutions. So if you think about IP, you have to think about these things. Well, you should. IP is about possibilities, not necessarily the pathway that you're following. And IP is always about uncertainty because we don't know what's going to happen. If you think about a company being a dot somewhere, so IP broadens all of your horizons. It helps you understand the problem because now you're looking at the problem from a more abstract point of view. It helps you think about suppliers, about the consequences of what you're going to do, about your competitors, about strategic partners, how you're going to make money, what investors might want to see, how can your plans be blocked, and alternatives. Now, all of these things come naturally when the IP person is trying to build an IP strategy, writing patents, saving secrets, and so on, because the IP needs to take these into account. Well, not necessarily needs, but really, really should. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept of a forcing function, but a forcing function is something that you put in a process, especially user interface, which forces you to stop a second and think and consider if you're doing the right thing. If you do IP properly, the end result of this IPing process is a narrative which ties together what you're doing, what the competition is doing, how you're going to make money, how there's going to be return on investment. That's a whole story, and it has to be coherent. And that's what we try to do when we're doing IP for a company. So if you allow the process to go properly and you don't cheat, you will get a forcing function which forces you to say, what about my competition? My patent will publish in a year and a half. What will my competitor copy from it? How will it help my competitor? Will it attract the right kind of people into the market or the wrong kind of people? Problem is that there's nobody forcing you to do IP properly. And if you know what you want, or if you've decided that you're doing innovation-based IP, then you're not going to be doing this IPing process, and all of these wonderful things that I spoke about in the last few slides will not happen. But if you do treat IP as a forcing function, it'll be great. What else does doing IP provide value immediately? There's something I call IP linguistics. It is possible but not recommended to describe new ideas using old words. And the process where you do IPing and you try to explain how your ideas will lead to value in the future of the company forces you to think about the best way to describe this connection. And you need it because you're trying to sell your company to investors. If you don't do it during the IPing process, you are going to do it when you prepare presentations for investors, maybe the first one, or if it failed, maybe the second one, but that's too late. You really want to be ready before. And again, IP has to consider the others, and your language will allow you to do that. It will allow you to think about and find the language to explain the connection, how the innovation will be understood by others, because patents, for example, are inherently read by other people. And understanding how other people from outside are going to look at what you're doing, I believe, is very important in helping you find the language that you will be using in your investment material. And I just want to point out, it's not only known audience, but also unknown audience. Because when we do IP, we don't know whose that IP will be used for or against. The other side of linguistics is the abstraction. Which abstractions are you using in order to describe your innovations? A typical startup company doesn't care about that question. They just, do what they do. But when you write a patent, you have to think, even if you're not doing any of the other IPing, writing a patent requires you to think about the technical innovations and the abstractions that you're using to describe them. Usually, if you have 10 claims, each claim adds another level of abstraction. This language, and every patent application defines a language, and I don't mean being your own lexicographer, which is twisting the meaning of existing words. So this process helps you define the language, and this language which you define is very useful for the technical team, because the technical team, while they're trying to solve a problem, don't really have the language which explains what exactly they're doing and what exactly they're not doing. But when they start working with a patent attorney, this language comes into being. And again, because this language is defined not only based on what you're doing, but also on what other people did before and what you don't want other people to do in the future, it helps break all sorts of fixations that inventors or innovators have about what it is that they're doing. Business strategy. So I said before, a lot of companies don't think too much about the business strategy, but when we're doing IP, we're looking for leverage points where the IP will be valuable, or we're looking for vulnerabilities in what we're doing or what we're planning on doing. So inherently, if you do the IP process, you're stress testing business moves and options that you're thinking of doing, and you're identifying where it is that the market has leverage points. So we might discover 20 leverage points while we're doing the IPing, decide to write patents about 5 of them, and the business people will choose one of them in order to be a strategic direction for a company. And All of this analysis can also help us by providing business information and highlighting freedom to operate issues. Now, just reminding, freedom to operate is a document which says this product appears to have freedom to operate or not in this field in view of the patents. But what we're talking about is the process where we detect what these risks might be, and not only say, here we have freedom to operate. And of course, this process of IPing is very naturally explorative. So what is this IP business doing for the company right now? So first of all, it builds up a valuable part of the company, which is the IP portfolio and the skeleton, which makes everything work. The clarity that IP provides, all of this language stuff I spoke before, identifying levels and so on, it is both value and also matures the company because the company is more organized. And let's think about three different types of companies. I was focusing more on I call it hyperbolic discounter startup, that they only really care about what's happening tomorrow. So they're super focused on the technical problem. And doing IP can force them to think about other issues, at least some minimum amount. There's a monogoal company. They know where they're going. They have a plan, 4 years ahead, what's it going to do and how's it going to get there. But because they're monogoal, they lack lateral thinking. By doing the IP process, they can get this lateral thinking. And sometimes we have the perfect company. It's goal-oriented and it plans ahead and so on, and it's so organized, it's probably already doing IPing. One of the things that IPing can help with is preventing top-down mandates. Instead of the instructions coming from on top and they must be good because we plan everything ahead, the process of IPing allows them to identify issues that don't come from on top. And in general, when you have plans, I said before that IP processes can be used to make the plans better. A different view of these now effects, and I want to clarify, each company can probably have a different now effect depending on the particular context. That's why I'm giving you different ways of looking at it. So if we look at it from a life cycle point of view, and we remember that we want to support all of these functions, not just management, but also R&D, marketing, investment. Think about a venture stage, which is the very beginning of the company. So I said already that IP can help build the language and vision and help your analysis and exploration. And it can help you build value. During a product market fit stage, if you have such thing, so the IPing can help guide the design of your product and reduce the number of iterations. But also when you flaunt your IP, you can use it immediately in order to encourage competitors to go somewhere else or be slower. During a growth phase, when the company's growing, if you've read interviews with the CEO of DeepSeek, one of the reasons why they decided to do open is in order to attract talent. Apparently, there's a problem in AI that many people may study in China, but then they go do postgraduate work and work in the United States. And in order for DeepSeek to build a ecosystem of AI professionals, they have to bring them home. By being open, having papers and so on, it helps attract talent. And there's a leadership phase when you're on top of the game and you want everybody to do what you want. So the IP will right now help control both the ecosystem and your competitors. What do we do? What do we not do? So first, I'll talk about the IP person. The IP person should not be doing R&D for the company. They shouldn't be inventing ideas. Okay, the company should be doing that. They know more and they have skin in the game. But the IP person should be shaking up the company and force them to do IPing, and sometimes require R&D to be done, particular to help the IP. Now, IP has output, and this output should be communicated. Otherwise, it's, waste of time. The company should be doing regular IP activities. It should do it honestly. It should do it not only for R&D. It should be using it for business intelligence or for simulations of various types. And I mentioned before, should be budgeting up from the bottom up and not only down, unless you're one of these wonderful companies where you have a real IP function near the top of the company, in which case you should start your IPing at lower levels. Till now, I focused on how IPing can generate value for the company, for the various functions of the company, but there is another function which can enjoy IPing, and that is the IP function. And one of the things that an IP function really needs is IP awareness in the company. And IPing helps build the infrastructure for dealing with IP later on. You need everybody to be aware. And if all of your company's value is an intangible, so there's IP everywhere, so everybody needs to know. And I've built like a simple metaphor of what IP awareness means. So if you have a cup, that's just being aware that something called IP exists, patents, secrets, and so on. If your cup has water in it, like this one, then you know what part of what the company does is or fits in IP. If you pour the water, that's equivalent to understanding how IP is flowing in the company and with relationships out of the company. If it's actually flowing into your mouth, that's awareness of how IP can do something useful. And if you're drinking while talking, so you might be getting hoarse, if you're in the sun, then that means that you have awareness of how IP is being leveraged for a need. And last but not least, if the water spills on the floor, which I won't show, that is a metaphor for being aware of all sorts of IP-related failure modes. So if you think about IP awareness, we have these 6 levels of IP awareness that we'd like to foster in the company, and we want to do it sooner rather than later. And doing the IPing process is very good. And even in companies that do have IP functions, often the employees see only the tip, the patents, but they don't understand what IP is doing inside, the using and abusing of IP. That doesn't happen. I had these other quadrants, and I said that all of them should be considered. And of course, this quadrant, the now and avoid risk, is often critical, and you have to deal with it immediately. The future, and especially generating opportunity, that's where strategy is. And I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to say file a lot of patents right now, but instead I'm saying think about IP right now. And this quadrant that I spoke about today, most of the investment is in talking and thinking. So it requires attention, but not so much money. And what I don't want to happen is not only that people should say, oh, we're not going to file patents, but also don't say because the cost is low, the importance is low. No, it's quite the contrary. The importance of this quadrant is very high. What do I want you to take home? That IP is one of the pillars of an innovation company, even if you're not protecting it or you're not aware of it. It's still there. IP can add value to the company now. Of course, can do later, but I want to focus that it can do it now. If you do IP properly, it's a wonderful forcing function to force the company to do all sorts of thinking ahead and thinking sideways it should be doing. Just because we're doing the thinking, most of you have heard Eisenhower who said, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. So IPing is like the equivalent of planning. And if I had my wish, management would have IP awareness and give IP early and regular thought. But at the very least, if you only take one thing from this whole talk, is that the use of IP should be ruled by hope, not by fear. Look for what you can do positive, not negative. Give you an example. Let's imagine that you're in charge of IP for a company called Vatwood, and they grow timber and vats. And for each one of the company stages, we can fill in all of the quadrants of the 2x2, both for risk and opportunity, and for now and for later, and consider what are the most important IP-related activities. Now, this exercise is really meant to force you to think about different reasons you have IP and when is that IP going to have an effect? Because it's very useful for many decision makers to show an immediate value of what you're asking money for rather than some future possible value. Okay, I am stopping the recording.